Our book today in the Thom Hartmann Book Club is The Decadent Society, How We Became the Victims of Our Own Success by Russ Douthat, a New York Times columnist. And this is from, it's about the middle of his first chapter. This is a subchapter titled The Limits of Neoliberalism. There's no shortage of theories to explain this great stagnation, to borrow a phrase from one of the theorizers, the George Mason University economist Tyler Cowen. And there's also no need to simply choose between them. Like most broad trends, the economic decadence of the developed world is overdetermined, and almost every serious attempt at explanation will contain some element of truth. The most politically appealing theories, the ones animating our populist and socialist insurgencies, tend to blame neoliberalism itself, claiming that the medicine for 1970s stagflation has proven to be poisonous in large doses. The push for ever freer trade has hollowed out Western economies, the argument goes, offshoring productive industries and killing decent jobs, making financiers and knowledge workers rich while the middle class shrinks steadily. Meanwhile, low tax rates intended to spur investment have enabled the rich to keep more of their gains while starving the programs required to protect the poor and boost the working classes. Antitrust policy has become so fixated on the so-called benefits of consolidation, lower prices for consumers, that it has ignored all the ways that market-dominant corporations can warp policies and strangle innovation. And anti-inflationary policies, forged to counteract a crisis that's now generations behind us, have been adopted as a dogma that's now by the West's financial and political elite, which demands fiscal austerity under every circumstance and deprives struggling economies of the cash they need to grow. You don't have to accept every aspect of this argument, and indeed the populists of the left and right disagree about which aspects to stress, to see that it describes a real phenomenon, perhaps not the outright failure of neoliberalism, but diminishing returns from some of its preferred policies, and an overconfidence among the Western leadership class that solutions from the 1970s are permanently applicable. On trade, for instance, the general principle that open markets have more winners than losers led policymakers to assume that this would necessarily happen and to overestimate how quickly communities affected by outsourcing would recover and how swiftly other sectors of the economy could compensate. In particular, the Massachusetts Institute of Technology economist David Autor has argued persuasively that the China shock, the dramatic offshoring that followed Beijing's entrance into the World Trade Organization in 2001, inflicted more economic damage on working-class communities in the United States than many experts anticipated, without generating the compensating growth and job creation expected elsewhere. This is not a knockdown case against free trade, just a case against overconfidence in its incautious application. And the same argument applies to other features of the neoliberal program. It's quite possible that lower tax rates spur growth and innovation when tax rates are cut from 70% highs, but also that a program of permanent upper bracket tax cutting, as practiced by America's Republican Party, won't produce the hoped-for spillover effects among the bottom 95%. It's possible that the initial economic insight that some corporate consolidation could be good for consumers was useful for antitrust decision-making in the 1970s and 80s, but needs to be corrected as monopolies regather. It's possible that a program of deficit reduction and tight money that makes sense when inflation is galloping doesn't make sense when we're closer to deflation. The countries sometimes need a loose monetary policy to fight stagnation, and having a financial overclass too fixated on the perils of a for-now imaginary inflation is a recipe for permanently lower growth. Then, alongside this brief against an overextended neoliberalism, there's a more subtle argument, pushed by the more serious sort. I think I skipped a page here. Sort of liberalism that the neoliberal program hasn't so much pushed too far as pushed in the wrong direction. In this argument, we don't need less deregulation, but a different kind than we have, because incumbents and insiders in the West have captured the sprawling regulatory state and used it to freeze out potential competition. The age of stagnation, according to this theory, is the fruit of what Brink Lindsay of the Niskensen Institute and Stephen Tellez of Johns Hopkins University describe as a captured economy. in which everything from land use rules to exclusionary zoning to occupational licensing to ever-expanding intellectual property protections to corporate subsidies and tax breaks all converge to create a system that's basically the worst of socialism and the worst of capitalism conjoined. Plutocratic and sclerotic, overregulated and undertaxed, with an upper class enriching itself off rents rather than innovation, and a service class that can't advance beyond its station. The overlap between this more libertarian argument and the left-wing critique of neoliberalism is apparent in one of the texts of the post-financial crisis left, French economist Thomas Piketty's 2013 tome, Capital in the 21st Century, which mined centuries worth of statistics to argue that capitalism inherently makes the rich richer because returns on capital will always be higher than simple economic growth unless some powerful force intervenes. The forces that intervened in the 20th century were the Great Depression and 2 world wars, which not only provided the impetus for massive government interventions, but destroyed outright a great deal of capitalist wealth. The book is The Decadent Society by Douthat.